This is the Culture Change Paradoxes webinar series from Onefish, Fish, and I'm Carrie Bedingfield. In this series, we explore some of the tensions and paradoxes experienced by organisations trying to move their culture. But culture is complex and it doesn't respond to modern management techniques, which are often rooted in command and control. Today, we're looking at values and specifically how to reconcile the tension between promoting a set of company values versus encouraging people to come as their authentic selves with their own values to work. With me is Rick Harris. Hi, Rick.
Hello. Good to be here.
Hi, Rick. And Rick is a researcher of human behaviour and in particular, the customer journey and importantly for today, the employee journey. So Rick, where does the company end and the employee start?
Well, I'm glad you phrased it that way round and not the employee end and the company start, because I guess the whole essence of an authentic workplace, which is something we'll get into today, is being able to bring your whole self to work. So if the employee has to end and stop that to be a sort of a company man, as they used to call it, then that would be a bad thing. But where does it end and start? Well, it is a blend, and I think to unpick that a bit, we will have to get into things like, well, where do values come from? And that means the company values as well as your own personal values, and that can be quite a journey. So we'll get into that, I hope.
So thinking about that, if we were to consider values an innately human trait, how is it that we start applying them to companies and organisations? So where do values come from? What are they? And how should we understand them?
Well, at its simplest, values are who we are. It's what makes us us. It's what makes me. And I think companies feel the same way. They want to have an identity. They want to create a community of belonging. So that you feel part of something perhaps bigger than yourselves. And so values help to draw people together. The risk is that they become quite a defining set. And that means that potentially, in order to fit in here, you need to be one of us and you have to be assimilated. And that's where I think this tension exists between who you are and bringing yourself to work, rather than spending all your time trying to fit in and fit around the company values. And that's the tension, that's the balance you have to look for.
And as a human, how do you find out what your values are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I would say is I don't think values are fixed. Just as we grow as people, our values can change, they can expand. Maybe even some of them can fall back. So it's a bit of a moving feast. Most people would say that their values are built in their background, their history, and they start from there. So our values come from people, role models. That might be our parents. That might be people we admire, people who inspire us. I've even spoken to, particularly in my healthcare work, spoken to people who say that the people that inspire them are fictional characters, but they just love the role that was presented, and that helps them to be a better person. And that's one of the great things I think about values, is they can come from whatever helps you be what you want to become, even if the character isn't real. So that's an inspiring thing. I also think that values can also be built on key moments in your lives. So again, a lot of the work I do is in healthcare, and when I talk to patients, they say that I only really discovered what I value in myself and in life after I had this life-limiting condition. And so a change of framework, something that brings life a little bit closer to the fore than perhaps we take it for granted a lot of the time, helps to really think about what matters to me, what I want to bring to the world. So moments of importance, moments of stress often bring people together. You see, it brings out the best of people in communities. And that's also a time when we can discover who we are. We're not always looking for it, but the environment brings it out. You also see it sometimes in moments of celebration. You look at great national moments of celebration, like you go back to the war and things like VE Day, and you see the British community come together in a way that we very rarely do as British people. It's really not in our nature. But actually, deep down in our core, there is something in the community that wanted to do that. But then it subsides again. And to bring it back to companies, this is, I think, a real challenge for companies. It's quite easy to make values come alive in a workplace on a special day when we're launching something, or even on a very sad day when something that we didn't want to happen has happened and we have to respond to a crisis. It's the everyday nature of companies, just as the everyday nature of people, that values it's harder to make them come alive. So I'm hoping we can get into a little bit today is ways that we can make everyday values live and breathe, rather than just the special occasion stuff that we probably know we can do.
And talk to me about some of the thought processes that might happen for employees when we try and launch, amplify, share, enliven organisational values.
Well, so let me introduce a concept called deep acting and surface acting. They're two different sort of things, but they're quite closely related, and that might help explore that. So deep acting is when you are trying to take something that's in your core, an emotion perhaps that's deep in your core, and you want to bring it sort of front and center stage. And that is something that may relate to a value that your company has, or even just a situation that your role in that organization requires. And that could be caring, or it could be fairness, it could be any number of different things. But it's where you look into yourself and you say, in order for me to deliver that for this person, this company, I need to reach into myself and bring this to the front. It's generally a positive thing, a good thing to try and do. The difference between that and then there's surface acting. And surface acting is when you put something, bring it to the surface that you are putting there to hide your true self. So it's faking it, really. It's a bit like a clown has a permanent smile on their face, as the song goes. Well, it's just there to fool the public, I think, as the lyrics of that song. And, you know, how authentic is a clown's smile when it's painted on? We know that it's just skin deep. It's surface acting. It's not their true selves. And that's generally something that is a negative thing, because you're faking it. And this is really built in evolutionary science, actually. If you look at how we have evolved as animals, we've evolved to read body language, to read particularly facial expressions, because that helps us understand how they're going to react. It makes people more predictable. When animals or people mask that, it makes them less predictable, and that makes us a bit uneasy. And it's one of the reasons why actually quite a lot of people are quite scared of clowns, because it's harder to read them because they've got this fake face on. So back to the company environment, it's the same thing. If everybody goes around with a permanent smile on their face and sort of trot out the company mantra, how real is that? People start to doubt it, and people see through that. And when I work with B2C companies in particular, consumers are very canny. They very quickly spot authentic smiling people trying to help, and people who have been trained to smile all the time. So I think when we look at bringing our best selves to work, the secret is to try and do more of that deep acting, where we're bringing the best of ourselves to our work, rather than we are faking a look or an angle that you think is just going to be right in the moment, but it's not really you.
So one of the things that we often come across when we work with organisations is that the values they create are designed to be, and we would we would participate in this. We would design values that were sufficiently face valid to be recognizable to people in the organization, but which were provided enough stretch to encourage people to move in a certain direction. And we might call that us on our best day. If I've seen that on the top of a slide, the title of a slide one time, I've perhaps seen it 100 times. So how do you relate this problematic surface acting, where people are feeling forced to adopt a value that they may not be feeling, with the other psychological construct around positive mental attitude, where by acting as if you are experiencing a particular emotion or doing things a certain way, you can build the capacity for that emotional, that behaviour in yourself. So, for example, I think the most robust studies in that area would say if you have low level depression and you look up and you smile, you feel better. So how do you relate that sort of aspirational acting as if benefit with what sounds like the quite exhausting process of surface acting?
I think the idea of us on a best day is a good example, because it helps you to kind of stretch yourself and sort of aim, try to do your best. I think the way I would balance that and suggest is to anchor it in the context of today. So there's nothing wrong with us on a best day is maybe not today. It's just you using that for inspiration, but to link it to the customer in front of you, or the person you're serving, or the colleague that you're trying to help, that's the actual reality of the context of what you're doing. And to take that inspiration, and it comes back to that where I was talking about in terms of where do people's values come from, what inspires you, is to draw in your mind that us on a best day, or that character in the film that I just admire and I wish I was more like that. Well, now's your opportunity in this circumstance to be more like that. But it's anchoring it, and then it becomes real, then it becomes authentic. Whereas if it's just a bit of an exercise, and this is one of the problems with doing workshops. So for example, yesterday, you may not know, but yesterday was World Values Day. And there are all sorts of stuff all over the web about here's some things you can do, exercises you can do in your organization to help you bring alive your values. And the problem with exercises like that is they are exercises, they're not real. And the way to get the best out of that is to make them as real as possible. Take a real example. Why not help a real person today rather than just sort of do it on a piece of paper? So the answer to your question is I would always try and anchor it in the reality, the context of today. And even if that's not really pressing, you can make it pressing. You pick an issue that was a problem last week that I haven't really fully addressed. And now's the moment I'm going to really tackle that. And I'm going to do that by bringing out the best I can be, or the best in our values. So it's trying to lean on as good as you can be, but the authenticity is based in the real life of now.
So how do you approach an organization where there are multiple tribes of people, each of them experiencing and valuing different things? So you and I have both worked on a number of companies where this would be true, and where one bundle of employees would be doing a particular type of job in a particular way, and another set would rightly be required to behave and act in a very different way to respond to their part of the organisation's landscape, and where, in order to create something that is resonant enough for all of them, all of those people, the values themselves are rendered virtually meaningless. They're so high level and generic.
I think part of the solution to that, it's quite a challenge. Part of the solution is that I sort of see values as layers, sort of intersectional, rather than they come as a fixed, immovable set. They all have to have the same weighting all at the same time. People actually generally want to get on with other people. we're quite social beings as humans. We just have our moments when we're not so good at it. So in a working environment, in an organization environment where, as you say, people can have different values, it's trying to find the sections or the layers of your own values that will fit nicely with others around you. And that doesn't necessarily mean to be they kind of merge perfectly and they are the same. It's about what can I bring with my values to add to the people in this room who have different backgrounds, could be different cultures, different ethnicities. I mean, you start to get into the sort of diversity aspect of it. But it's not necessarily trying to conform and trying to find common ground. It's trying to find the best ingredients to fix the solution. So you might be bringing something that's quite different from others, but if it's helping to meet the goal, then you're adding to the culture in the room rather than you're trying to conform. And I think this is a struggle for businesses, is they lean a bit too much towards conformity and not enough towards actually welcoming difference.
So that sounds like, instead of doing what we might traditionally have done, which is to try and find the subset, so the shared area of the Venn diagram, which applies to everybody, instead, might we see it as a superset?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that valuing difference is probably where companies need to go. So at the moment, with Me Too and with a whole load of other it's almost become movements, and government publishing, requiring companies to publish where they are on pay grades and gender and so on. They're making it about diversity in traditional ethnic, gender and so on. I think where it needs to go is welcoming differences. So rather than trying to put everything on a scale, it's trying to bring in uniqueness, because the people you're bringing in have their own style, their own nature. And by trying to boil it all down to a simple variable like gender or ethnicity is trying to put a single variable in the place of a very complicated, multifaceted person. So there are things that we have to do for that, and I understand the need for that in terms of fairness. But in terms of getting the most out of people, we should not necessarily be counting, that we always have an equal number of this and an equal number of that. We should be looking for what best meets the challenge of today. And that is, as I say, it's likely to be something that you need to encourage people to do, because naturally we do try and conform, not always go out of our way to conform. I mean, even back to the sort of biology of it. I lived in Australia for 3 years. And when I came back to the UK, and I would meet Australians in the UK, people would say to me, my old friends would say to me that somehow I'm seem to be slipping into this Australian drawl again. It's not something I deliberately do, but it just seems to be happening. And it's just because unconsciously, when you're in Australia, you want to fit in, and your whole nature tries lots of different tricks to do that. And one of the things is you pick up on how people sound, and we take the mickey out of people for doing that. It's seen as a weakness. It's seen as being inauthentic to do it, but it's actually not inauthentic. It's us trying to find ways to come together. And whether that is not quite as blatant as the way we sound, but the way we are. And that can be emotions. And it's not so very long ago that where emotions were really frowned upon in business. You go even further back to the 60s. I remember the company uniforms. My father used to be a salesman for NCR, and they had to wear a white shirt. It was a white shirt, not just the suit and everything else. He wore a pink shirt one day and got walked into the managing director's office to be reprimanded but he wanted to just a little bit of difference, to bring a little bit of standoutness, and it was frowned upon. Now you'd like to think that's more natural, but we unfortunately, authentic workplace has taken that too far, and people think, it's all about wearing shorts and sandals in a formal environment, or that kind of thing. And those are the sort of simple symptoms that bring it to life. But the everyday reality, that's the key thing, is how do you make it everyday real? And it's a challenge. It's something that we should, as organizations, we should be encouraging people to meet that challenge rather than we give them a fixed set of values to try and make work every day. And that's hard, particularly when those values are very common things. You know, there was some great work by a lady called Denise Lee Yon. If you find her book, it's called Fusion: How Integrating Brand Values and Culture Powers the World's Greatest Companies. And one of the things that she advises is, she said, if clients want to use words like teamwork and fun and customer centricity in your values, I ban those, because they are table stakes. They're hygiene factors. You know, who doesn't want teamwork in their organization? So they're you know, she pushes organizations to come up with something that is really distinctive, that enables people to make it truly about us rather than just about sort of happy, nice people. And it's the same with ourselves.
We have two nice techniques for that. One is we would always flip a value and say, would the negative be an equally viable option? And if it wouldn't, then it's probably not a value.
Yeah, that's great.
Which is one technique, and the other is the cover the logo technique. So if you debranded it and put it into Helvetica and covered the logo up, would you still recognise it as this organisation, or could it apply to any of your competitors? So two really simple ways to do that. I'm just coming back to your concept of, which I think reflects quite a mindset shift for change agents, people responsible for values, which is, rather than, we're drawing a lot from the complexity sciences in this series, rather than trying to take an ambiguous, unpredictable environment and reduce its complexity, instead we want to handle its complexity, to allow its complexity. So it's the difference between a PIN code and a fingerprint, for example. So you see a fingerprint in an organizational context as the sort of unique print that group of people make. Remove one of them, put them in another organization, you could never recreate that fingerprint, rather than seeing values as something and as something where you are trying to constantly simplify it, make it easy to understand, etc. So can you just reflect a bit on the work that you and I might be asked to do, which is to come up with, to derive some values, to come up with 3, to give them a name, to create some visual language around them, to amplify and embed them. Now, we might do that in quite a sophisticated way. Is it okay to have 3 values with names that everybody's supposed to know, or does that completely fly in the face of encouraging and allowing this diversity of this superset?
I think that a couple of things there. So one is it's where those values, as company values, if we're talking about company values, is where they come from. What are they anchored in? Are they just dreamed up by a senior management team one day because we think that they'll be palatable for shareholders and so on? Is that authentic, or is it something much deeper than that? You know, you look at some of the great companies that had founders that really did build it from something deep within themselves, and it probably started off life as their personal values. There is real sort of legacy to draw upon, and that, I think, is sometimes when companies lose sight of where they're going, they lose their values. You can see their companies drift. You know, I'm happy to go on record and say that, you know, Marks and Spencer is a good example of this. Marks and Spencer used to stand for innovation in this country, and you would see things first there because they would be out there, and they would encourage their buyers and their staff to really push the envelope. And some of the products that they brought to the UK were never seen here before. They've lost that innovation, and now they've become almost a place of drabness. You know, that their standard, the way they lay their, not just the products, but the way they lay their stores out, they've lost something in their value set, has drifted, and it's very visible in the way they come across now, and no surprise that they're struggling a bit as an organization as a result. Having said that, the other thing I think which helps a company to create a set of values that is meaningful and that will last is to avoid functional values. I see so many companies that their values are, so for example, you see, fast food companies talking about being speedy and efficient. That's the nature of fast food. That's nothing to do with you. Every fast food company needs to be speedy and efficient, otherwise they're not fast food. So they are too operationally driven to things that they need to be as a business model, and they're making them values, and that's an error. And I would encourage people to guard against that. And so, does that stop people from? I mean, I'll give you a good example. Zappos. So Zappos is quite a famous US company. Tony Tsai, who was perhaps well known for going the extra mile in customer service, and that's probably the context. I know them both, but they have a company value which is wow, and it expresses an emotion, how they want the customer to feel, rather than great customer service, which doesn't drive the emotions, and it doesn't really take you anywhere. As wow as you have, that is the response I want from a customer. And some of the stories that one reads about how Zappo employees have interpreted that have been amazing. I mean, extraordinary. In some cases, like you could argue a bit crazy, like getting on planes to send pairs of shoes that people needed in a great hurry. But actually from a company reputation point of view, that is making a massive difference that just following a handbook may not. Another example is what Nordstrom's do. They don't have a training book. They just say do the right thing to their employees. That's all the training they give them, and they ask their employees to draw from within themselves. What do you think is the right thing to do here in this scenario, rather than standardize a value of fairness or something that it would be easier to train in and gain consistency from. And this is another challenge: is consistency a goal? Most companies are looking for that consistency because they think it drives efficiency and productivity, predictability. That makes it easier to plan and maybe easier to financially predict. But there is a flip side to that. There's a cost to always looking for consistency, and particularly in people-oriented businesses and organizations. You need to give the individual, both the person you're serving and the person who's doing the serving, the space to show themselves, to get the most value out of what they're doing. And sometimes that requires inconsistency, that requires specialness. In healthcare in particular, whilst we work on population-based data to understand conditions, the individual response to a condition, to a treatment that they're given to fix that condition, is truly individual. And the best nurses are not the ones that necessarily always follow the values of the NHS. And I myself am an NHS governor, so I'm kind of drilled, not quite brainwashed, but I'm very close to the values of the NHS, and I believe in them. But when you're in front of a patient with a specific situation, you're not looking for the consistency of those values. You're looking to do the right thing. You can draw upon those values, and the nurse should be drawing upon her values as a person and indeed as a practitioner of her training. So there's a combination of things happening, and the organisation, I think, should be looking to be part of that rather than to own it. So the values are an enabler. They're not a rule. So just to make them a rule book, but I don't think you get the most of it.
So just exploring the sort of tensions at the edge of that, if we were to push that to its extreme. So one example I can think of recently where an individual's values overrode an organisation's values at great cost was the example of a consultant in a palliative care unit on the South Coast who herself prescribed and created a culture in which patients were hugely overprescribed with drugs in their final sedation drugs in their final days and weeks, and though that fell outside the prescribing guidelines, her own values, so I think her argument was that she wanted to spare people pain and distress in their final weeks, created this sort of outlier that contrasted with either what was allowed or with what the NHS valued itself. So how do you prevent those? If you're trusting people to do what they believe is the right thing, how do you keep that safe?
Okay, so healthcare is a good example of that, but I think it spans many other industries as well. Look at whistleblowing as a concept. Now, this is something that's very close to the NHS, but close to a lot of industries where safety is a key part of life. Cultures should not be if you take healthcare, if you see a problem in healthcare, doctors are drawn to fix it for that patient. That's how they're trained, and that makes total sense. But in order to help the organization to understand that, they should really be systemizing their response. So they should be teaching the organization that this patient had a problem and we need to look for other patients with the same issue, so we can look and see if we are causing this as a system, as a company, rather than always taking it to the individual. And whistleblowing had to be institutionalized because people were frightened of not doing the right thing, and they were just following the company line. And whistleblowing has almost become now, you had to put some legal confidence around it to encourage people, to give people the space to do it when their values said to them, I really ought to be calling this out, but I'm frightened to for career reasons or lots of other things. And that's a good example of where company values and the ethics that lie behind doing what you think is right, for the benefit of the company as well, or for the organization. You're not helping the organization by not shining a light on things that are not right, and in some cases even not lawful. So I think there is a personal responsibility, and the law is helping that to come to bear. The flip side is when people take that personal responsibility as their own kind of crusade, and that's where process needs to be appropriate to the situation. So there needs to be ground rules, but sometimes you do. I mean, working with clients recently where there are issues of personal safety for an individual, where they feel that the company isn't doing enough to ensure their personal safety. They have a responsibility to bring that to the company, but they also have a responsibility to themselves to be safe. And that might mean doing something today because, I can bring it to the company's attention and maybe in 3 months we'll have a policy. But right here and now, there's a genuine personal safety risk and I need to deal with it on the day. You need to feel confident that your company would be proud of you for doing the right thing in those circumstances and putting your safety as an employee first, and indeed maybe the general public or the customers that you're using and so on. So there is a fine line between those two, but I think it is the company's responsibility to lay that out up front and to say, here are our ground rules and what we expect on a day-to-day basis, but there will be occasions where you need to do the right thing. And that's why I like that Nordstrom's example, because it lays that as the kind of starting point rather than as the outlier.
So I can see how where there is a tangible trampling of a clear value, where it's clearly the wrong thing to do, and probably there's a tangible safety issue, so a physical safety issue, that becomes a whistleblowing issue, and it goes into that kind of mindset and process. What about the more day-to-day values clashes, where you don't want to be that person who's always pulling everybody up or calling things out or not going with the flow, but where it's clear that, or you experience an ongoing continuous clash either between the value that the organisation says it espouses and what you're actually experiencing in meetings and day-to-day work, or where there's a tension between your own value and what people seem to be valuing at work. So how should people respond to that?
So I think there's two levels to that. First of all, if one is seeing in an organizational environment, a meeting or whatever, that values are not being brought to life, so that the organization has a set of values and these values are clearly not being adhered to in this environment, I think it helps for employees to call that out. If you look at it the other way around, if you ignore it, you're almost part of the problem. So there is an onus on saying, are we doing what we say we do as an organization with this issue, with this challenge, with this new product launch, or whatever it happens to be. So that's at one level. I think at the point you make about we are behaving in line with our values, but personally I feel very uncomfortable with that because it doesn't fit me. I do think that comes back to this idea of multifaceted or layered values. So on the one level, I think it's for the employee to look at things where they do feel that there are values that they share with this issue, rather than always looking for something that grates. Because nothing is going to be perfect, and you won't always find a perfect match in every circumstance with all your values and all the company values. That's not reality of life. But I would introduce this idea of a sort of cultural add rather than cultural fit. If you feel that you have something that you want to bring to the company and to try and achieve for the company, and you're not getting a good fit with the way company does things, then suggest another way. Don't necessarily make it personal though, because if you make it personal, then how scalable is that? The company might have 5,000 employees. If we all made that my personal values struggle with this situation, that could make for a very complicated and a very long meeting. But if you bring to bear and say, there may be a better way here, this I think can make what we do, we can achieve more for people we serve, and bring that to bear. Knowing where it comes from, you can feel proud of the fact that I made that change, I helped bring that change to bear, but I don't necessarily have to make it a personal crusade. And there may well be other people in the room who would love to have done the same, but perhaps didn't have the courage to say it there and then. So you're also helping others to bring their own sense of values and even ethics. And I think there's, people are a bit scared of using the word ethics in a business context because it makes it sound a bit pejorative. But there's no shame in, again, in some industries, ethics are absolutely front and center of the way things work. And I'm not just talking about law, but in healthcare and lots of other industries, ethics are a really key part of what we do. I sometimes would think that actually more companies should make ethics part of the way we operate, and even run courses and education on ethics, because it does help us to judge some of these difficult challenges. They're hard things to act upon, and ethics teaches you to deal with it a bit.
So can I address the elephant in the virtual room? Which is, you've mentioned a few times things that employees could or should feel responsible for doing. The idea that you can add your personal values to the superset, that you can call things out, and all that is fine if you are full of resources, if you have had generally a positive experience with an organisation so far, and you feel a high degree of agency at work. And for most people, that's not true. So the people who give webinars like this and talk and listen to webinars like this in general have a fair amount of agency. People who they are representing in general would perceive they have very little agency, and may have tried ineffectively to bring their whole selves to work, make a contribution, challenge something in the past. And they might feel that the organisation presenting these values to them, however they were derived, is yet another example of this company telling me what I should think. They want my time, they want me to go the extra mile, and now they want to tell me how I should be, what I should be valuing. Well, I've got a few choice words for the organisation about that. So how would you respond to that?
I agree with you that it's common. And a lot of people struggle with that. Goodness, there's I think one needs to try and head some of that off at the pass before you just turn it into problems in a job role or problems with the way we're structuring things. So if I look at some of the best organizations I've met, they take the opportunity early on through the life of the employee, even when they leave in things like exit interviews, to learn from how people are feeling that clash. So a great example is I was with a company last year, and they did part of their onboarding and induction. In the first week, they make a real point of saying, tell us about our culture. Tell us about the way we do things. What are your first impressions? Because they know that before long, you'll be one of us, and you will take on board some of the things that are issues, but we've learned to live with, and it's just become the way things are around here. And they made a point of getting those people really early on, before they'd absorbed and had any of the sort of corners rubbed off them, to capture that insight, to help build change, positive change in their organizations. In the same way, when people are so frustrated with the example you gave just then, that they think, I need to leave the organization. If things have gone that far and they've made a decision that maybe they do need to leave, then that's an opportunity to learn, not to say you weren't the right fit and that we should, maybe we made a mistake with you, or maybe that there's, that's an opportunity still to learn. So I think if you can do some of those things to mitigate the situation that you've described, you can reduce their number. So that's the first thing. That doesn't mean you're going to remove all of them. So for the ones that you have left, I think community is probably the best answer. So to involve others and see how widespread this is. Is this an individual challenge where it could be about fit? Or is actually, this is the canary in the coal mine, and almost everybody feels like this, or a whole team or a whole department or a whole office. And then that is a real time for change. And that needs to be addressed head on with something special, not the way we normally do things. You need to go to extraordinary measures at that point, because you need to demonstrate that you've heard. And that's where hopefully you can lean on your values to do that. If your values are hygienic values, table stakes ones I've talked about before, about, fast and convenient and fun, that tells you that your values are missing something and maybe part of the problem in the first place. But when situations get bad like that, that's when you need to make a step change, rather than try to tough it out with your existing processes just not working hard enough. There will be occasions when the person is a wrong fit, and there's no shame in that. Every company has made wrong hires, and there's usually blame on both sides, that we didn't explain what we're about well enough. Perhaps the person didn't explain who they were, the employee, well enough. So there's no shame in that. Again, the trick is with those situations is to learn from it. I met an organization last year who hired a CEO who's gone within 6 months, and they acknowledged the mistakes they made as an organization in not creating a role that was clear enough to attract the right person. And it was, the HR team and the chairman in particular took it, upon themselves to do better next time. And so it's easy to just run straight to the negative and say, this is antagonistic and so on. But I think when you do reach that situation, you need to make a step change, and that's how I would deal with it.
So in a moment, I'm going to invite anybody on the call who would like to ask a question to do so, either by typing into the chat or just by unmuting themselves and asking it. And in the meantime, Rick, do I have your permission to share a story just following on from that question?
Go for it. Yeah.
So my experience is that organisations try to control things, and they try to control things that often are not easy to control. So things that are complex, unpredictable, emergent. And one way in which they can respond differently is to allow a bit more to happen. So to create a place or a time or a way in which people can speak to each other rather than be spoken to by the organisation. And I had a really interesting experience of this 6 months ago at a builder's merchant supply company, where we ran 3 workshops in service of trying to develop their employee value proposition, but for people who possibly some of them would never have been to a meeting in their lives before. Many of them had not been to the support office. And when they arrived, they came in high-vis. Some of them wore earplugs and some of them kept their high-vis, not their earplugs, but they kept their high-vis on the whole time during the session. And in one of those workshops, there were two people who were pretty vocal about how terrible they thought things were, really from start to finish. And my instinct as a facilitator was to either kind of really show them that I heard, or give them lots of airtime, or try and close it down, or basically try and control it. But I went out for 5 minutes to do something. When I came back, there was quite a kind of heated debate that had ensued. So I'd left a question in the room, and when I came back, the organisation was being defended vociferously by the 34 other people in the room who were saying, well, I just don't experience that, and why can't you talk to your manager about that, and I know your manager's great. So that self-facilitation was doing the job for me far better than I could, and did reveal that they were two particularly disenfranchised people, but also generated this quite powerful voice in the room, which was, we're not perfect, and this is not a perfect organisation, but it's good enough, and I will call you out if you're going to kind of spread it kind of incite dissatisfaction. And I was so fascinated, I thought maybe I just need to shut up for the rest of the hour and see what emerges.
That's a great story, and certainly as a facilitator, I've come across examples like that, a loud voice that maybe pushes people too far, and they end up, the rest of them could defend the organisation.
Indeed, and there's one other example actually, which is from years ago, from Mondelez. It's stories in the public domain. They spoke about it at our conference, where we would allow people to kind of visualise what they thought should be done and how easy or difficult it was on a great big wall. And then actually on a number of occasions, it was a roadshow, there were 100 people having a conversation. And people would say things like, well, that's a really big problem, but nobody here can deal with it. That's what senior managers should be doing. And rather than jumping in and us saying, well, but what could you do about it? We kind of tried to say nothing. And we found that other people in the room would say, yeah, but what we could do is this. And as soon as we allowed enough space that people could respond to each other, they made much more progress than they possibly could have done if we, as the sort of perceived adults in the room with the right answers, had tried to kind of engineer that result.
Yeah, and that, yeah, I can see lots of organisations be frightened of that. So one thing I would add to that is there's what's really in vogue at the moment is employee engagement surveys, pulse surveys, constantly checking in with employees about different topics, and sometimes you can get some quite negative responses from that. There's less effort goes into co-creation software, so the likes of Slack and Yammer and others that enable individuals to talk to each other. And if that is framed in terms of, by all means, highlight problems, and some people will highlight them more loudly than others, but the goal of this channel is to solve problems rather than just to highlight problems, then the tone changes a little bit. And you do find, I've seen in companies, particularly in Slack, where you do get a bit of sort of almost crowd moderation, where they don't like to see this being used as a channel simply to diss the company, in a way that I found employee surveys often do. They're there as a rare mouthpiece where I can, vent my spleen. But that's because there are very few opportunities in employee surveys to creatively look at solutions. And it normally ends up flooding out problems, and then we'll have to take that into a workshop environment or some kind of focus group or something where we can start to push towards solutions. But there are ways, in this digital online environment, particularly if you're looking across international offices where getting people physically together is tough, people could be using some of this software to bring communities together with the aim of solving stuff, with a rather more positive spin than just dissing one or two loud, very disenchanted voices that then the others have to say, yeah, it's not really that bad. So yeah, I think there are ways to solve some of that.
And that keys in quite nicely to the idea that the people who are experiencing the problem are the best people to design a solution for that problem, and bring decision making closer to the people who will implement that decision. So let's take questions. So if anybody has a question for Rick, please do unmute yourself and ask it, or you can type it into the chat function as well. And we'll just pause for a moment of reflection while you decide if you'd like to ask a question or not.
Good morning, Rick. So we've talked a lot about the values of employees versus the values of the company and the administration of the company. But we've not talked much about the value of the values of the shareholders, and which are largely not changeable. Have you got any words to say about that?
Yeah, so shareholders, we quite often see public companies that have the quarterly meetings to go to the city, and then the AGM where the shareholders are in the room. My challenge to companies facing those is, are you proud of what you're bringing them? You don't always bring them great results. You don't always bring them the dividends that maybe they're hoping for, but are you proud of the actions that you are taking to improve things or to continue to do great things if your company's doing well? They should be framed in the company values. If there's a problem with that, then I think there really is a problem in the nature of the business. So you can't always guarantee to have happy shareholders, because we're not always in positive times financially for the company. But what we can do is try and use our values to try and stay true to the nature of the business, even if the cycle is a bit of a downturn one. I think it actually works against you with your shareholders if you try to hide dissonance with those values. So it's a way of staying on it, having an honest conversation, and the opportunity to use your values in a genuine way, rather than always shine a light on them when they're positive, and when things are not going so well, you kind of don't really talk about it so much. And I think you do see the most reputable companies in their annual reports and their direct dealings at meetings with shareholders, they do bring that to bear rather than hide it. My experience is the ones that hide it, it usually comes back to bite them. So it's a bit of a false economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, my experience from a previous life is, if there is a change in ownership and shareholder direction, that often doesn't get reflected in the company values that then get espoused to the employees. Does result in a change of direction, and that's where sometimes leaders within a company can feel their integrity being challenged, where they're saying one thing but needing to plow forward with a slightly different path.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nick.
So Julie asks for your thoughts, Rick, on the tension that she's seen between an organisation's very understandable desire to create clarity about what those organisation values mean, with the resistance from others to reduce values just to a kind of set of transactions and bullet points. And in the light of the fact that in many organisations, people are very keen to know exactly what the values really mean, because living the values might be part of their performance appraisal.
So, yeah, I mean, making it too mechanical certainly isn't going to help. But it comes back to what we touched on earlier with authenticity in terms of the real life, the context in front of us. Often when I go into organisations and I see stories on the wall, often from customers or even suppliers in some cases, that just had to say how great something was, and I wanted you to know this, and I think it wouldn't be recorded anywhere. That's where living the values comes to life. It doesn't have to list the values, verbatim in order to respect the values. Otherwise, I think it becomes a bit wooden or sort of, as you say, sort of transactional. So I think my thought on that is that let's not be too rigid about it. Let's give the values a bit of breathing space. If the values if they do say fairness, we can interpret fairness in lots of different ways and look for that in everyday life and encourage people to talk about it and to celebrate it. But it doesn't have to be written up as we saw 28 examples of fairness, or we didn't see enough fairness yesterday, because then it does get very mechanical and a bit wooden and a bit fake, really, and it feels a bit worn out. So yeah, I think giving it a bit of space to breathe, but also to seek out that everydayness. If values are just something like, I know that people, you see it on posters in the wall, companies are very want to frame their values clear so everyone can see them. That doesn't mean anything in truth. Putting a poster on a wall or putting it on your lanyard or whatever it is, it's the real life stuff that contains the values. So there's one thing to define them and print them, but it's making it happen in real life and making the link between what we did today and the way we behave today. Yeah, that's living the values. Forget the words. You know it when you see it, when you feel it, and employees know that in their hearts, and that's the thing. That's where for me it really matters.
Can I just add something there? Because I think what you've made me reflect on then in terms of, sort of performance appraisal is the issue. I've got a particular client in my mind. They've got a what section and a how section, and the how section is the values, and it seems to me that's doing the opposite of what you just described, of seeing it in context and seeing it in reality. It's artificially separating the two, and I think that's maybe a large part of what sort of drives the issue, and then drives this appetite for, so tell me what that actually looks like. Whereas if it was sort of just one holistic, what did you deliver, and in doing that, to what extent did you sort of embody what's important to us as an organisation, that would be quite a different question.
Absolutely, Julie, and indeed it. And how is it built? It's back to that culture ad. What is that experience that's hopefully a success? Encouraged us to stretch those values even more. Again, it's not back to the words; it's the way we enact them. And maybe the thing that was kind of extraordinary about the way we behaved in this example can become more commonplace in future, if only because we're bringing it to life today and we're sharing it with others around the organisation. So yeah, I think that's very true.
Thank you so much, Nick and Julie, for questions. We're going to close there. Can I say a huge thank you to Rick Harris? And Rick, where should people find you if they want to continue the conversation?
Probably the easiest place to find me is probably on LinkedIn. We can share the link, I guess, in sort of post stuff that we send out. But if you just type in Rick Harris, Customer Faithful, into LinkedIn, you'll find me there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you everybody for joining. Next week we have Andrew Wood, also known as Woody, talking about how you can manage your own relationship to change as you help people through their own journey. And it promises to be quite a real and gritty session where he talks about some personal wounds, the feeling of being a lightning conductor for other people's journey, and how he has for himself and for others addressed the needs of the change agent as they help an organisation undergo its change. So see you next week, and many thanks.